Welcome to our online discussion sessions on the events of Karbala and the mourning rituals. Tonight we have with us Dr. Amina Inloes from California, Dr. Syed Muhammad Fatimi from Birmingham, Dr. Kumail Rajani from Exeter, and Shaykh Ali Kermalli from Qom. The topic of discussion for tonight is post-Karbala and Arbaeen. Imam Khomeini, in one of his speeches, had said that the killing of Hazrat Ali Asghar in Karbala demonstrates that those people wanted to finish off Imam Hussein and his uprising and conceal it fully within Karbala. From this, the scholars and the orators often deduce that the reason why Imam Hussein took his women folk with him, and especially Lady Zainab and Bibi Kulthum, was that after his martyrdom, they could then convey his message and his revolutionary stand to the people beyond Kufa and beyond Iraq, to the people of Sham and the people of Hijaz and Medina. Dr. Inloes, Dr. Amina, could you tell us what was the role played by Bibi Zainab, Lady Zainab, and Lady Kulthum and other women folk in this respect?
Yes, well, as we all know, as the historical narrative did unfold, they did give a number of speeches, especially in Kufa and in Damascus before the seat of the Caliph, which have been recorded in various sources, in which they did stand up for their side of the situation and give people a different view from what Yazid was propagating, and apparently called people's attention to the fact that Yazid had in fact committed a grave crime against his faith as well as the family of the Prophet, and that after they went to Medina they continued to say this.
And would it be right to assume, I would ask anybody, just very briefly, that Bibi Zainab or the speeches of Lady Zainab and Lady Kulthum and the manner in which they were taken and paraded through the streets of Kufa and subsequently until they got to Damascus was a chief cause for the uprisings against Bani Umayyah from aftermath of the killing of Imam Hussein. For example, we have the Tawabin, we have Muhammad ibn Hamdallah in Medina, we have Abdullah bin Zubair in Mecca, we have Mukhtar Thaqafi, so on and so forth.
I mean, I'm not sure you can always prove causality and intention historically beyond what is said. Abdullah ibn Zubair seems to have had his own personal agendas. I'm not saying al-Mukhtar didn't, but he seems to have been a bit more along the lines of his own personal agendas. And I do think for people who were aligned with the cause of Ahl Bayt, such as al-Mukhtar, it wouldn't have mattered so much whether or not they were captive, just because he would have been very upset at the killing of Imam Hussein. I think that their role is more with respect to people who were simply ignorant of what had happened, or people who were a bit more on the fence, like some of the people of Kufa who, for example, did not stand up for Imam Hussein, that this caused some regret and some guilt and some sorrow among them. So perhaps she was able to bring that out more. But I do think that for people like al-Mukhtar, who were, as text suggests very clearly in the line of Imam Ali, the response probably would have been the same either way. But again, what if is a difficult question, and causality can also be a difficult question.
But nonetheless, it was used as a pretext to rise against the Bani Umayyah, the king of Imam Hussein.
Yes, I see what you're saying there. Sorry, I thought you meant specifically their speeches. Are they a historical cause for the uprisings of al-Mukhtar and Ibn Zubair?
No, that's what I meant initially. But I'm saying nonetheless, they must have used the state of Bibi Zainab or Lady Zainab and their captivity as an impetus towards causing the people to uprise.
Personally, just off the top of my head, it seems like al-Mukhtar's main slogan was for the blood of Imam Hussein. But like I said, I'd really have to go through the texts to see if it's recorded that he specifically mentioned that. Although it would seem perfectly reasonable that it is a contributing factor. I'm just trying to be very precise historically, and some others might come up with some texts off the top of their head that do support that view. I don't think there's any problem with it. I'm just trying to be precise.
A related sort of a question to Shaykh Ali Kermalli. Bani Abbas used the pretext of the death of Imam Hussein for their popular uprising against the Bani Umayyah. Am I correct in believing that?
Exactly. One of the slogans the Bani Abbas used, yes, was the death of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So going to even the previous question, I don't know if we can prove the causality very clearly. What comes out is, for example, from the Tawwabun and the Mukhtar's movement, what I feel is the death of Imam Hussein and how he was killed became maybe a cause for their uprising. But did Bibi Zainab really inspire the Kufans to really stand up? That's something I believe history is a bit mute on that. So I don't know if we can really give a very clear answer to the causality as Dr. Inloes poses.
So then again, we hear quite often from the orators that Yazid was exposed to the speeches of Lady Zainab in Damascus, and she changed the dynamics of Damascus to the extent that Yazid feared keeping them there within Damascus as captives.
Personally, I feel to an extent, but I don't feel the way the orators presented it would, the way they portray the whole picture. I don't think so. It was only Lady Zainab's role in what she did and how Yazid was exposed. Because if you notice some of the literature, it's a bit confusing. Yazid even, if you look at the Sunni literature, there's some sympathy towards Yazid also. Now, for me, that kind of sounds that I don't know if there was a very clear picture of Yazid in picture. Yes, Ibn Ziyad can be the culprit, but I don't know if we can put it that way for Yazid also.
Where were the heads of Imam Hussein and some of the prominent members of Imam Hussein's family whose heads were paraded? Where were they eventually buried?
Okay, that's a question to me?
That's it to you, yes.
Okay. In regards to the heads of Imam Hussein and the martyrs, from the reliable history, what I found out was that history tells us that the heads were taken from Karbala to Kufa to Sham. That much history tells us that the heads reached Sham. But from Sham back to where it went, I feel it's basically a guesswork and assumptions going on within history. That's my humble understanding. I personally, when I look at history, if you look at the sources, for example, the Shia sources will tell you the main two places where the heads went was Karbala and Najaf. The Sunni sources would go for Sham and Medina and the other cities, okay? Now, strangely, this is my understanding, and I'll really hope if the other panelists can share light on this, but what I found out that the Shia scholars incline towards Karbala and the burial in Karbala, it's out of shuhra and fame only. I couldn't see any evidence for that. It was purely fame, which Sheikh Saduq initially started, that the heads were buried in Karbala. And after Sheikh Saduq, it eventually went with all the Shias. So if somebody believes in shuhra, yes, perfectly, it's fine. But I don't know if there is good evidence to show in Karbala. Rather, we have good evidence to show that it was buried in Najaf. In our books of riwayat, we have that the heads were buried in Najaf, for example. But the riwayats are inconsistent. Now, surprisingly, when it comes to historians, and this is what I personally find a conflict between hadith and history now, and I don't know, we haven't been able to sort out yet where should we incline. Historians, for example, Ibn Sa'd inclines, because Ibn Sa'd is even earlier than Saduq. So Ibn Sa'd inclines that the head of Imam Hussein was buried in Medina in Baqi. Baladhuri is also in the 3rd century. He is also saying it was buried in Sham. So personally, I feel that I don't know if we can have a very proper conclusion on this. I personally have adopted silence on this issue because there's a lot of guesswork happening. So silence is better on this issue, according to my opinion.
No, thank you. Dr. Kumail, in the account of Jabir ibn Abdullah coming for the visitation of Imam Hussein in Karbala, you need to shed light whether it's just a popular sort of a narrative or if there is any factuality to it. But in the way he salutes Imam Hussein, he says, shall you not respond to your friend? And then after that he says, but how can you respond when your head is not attached to your body? Dr. Kumail, can you give us any insight into that?
The first record which I see as far as the burial of head is concerned, as Shaykh Ali Kermalli alluded to, the Sheikh Saduq onwards as far as Shi'i sources are concerned. However, Abu Rayhan Biruni has an account as far as anthropological report is concerned, an account which he presents is like Shi'i in the region where he compiled his encyclopedia. He mentions that there was the day of Arbaeen in which the heads were returned back to Karbala, and so it does suggest like towards the 5th century there was somehow popular narrative among the Shi'i tradition. As far as Jabir is concerned, Jabir bin Abdullah al-Ansari, that narration, the entire narration where he and like Ati al-Awfi, they both collectively pay joint visit to Karbala and lament on the martyrdom of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his companions. That comes from the 6th century. Ibn Ahmad ad-Din Tabari, a lengthy account. The whole episode and the wordings which is used in al-Tabari, and by the way, this is Ahmad ad-Din Tabari, we are talking about 6th century after Hijrah, 13th century Common Era. And in that, it does mention, but the wordings and the lengthy account depicts that, that is something which is meant for oration and sort of poetry as opposed to any historical event. So I won't necessarily consider that encounter or that visitation or the correspondence between Jabir and Atiya as any sort of like, historical evidence or otherwise.
Staying with you, Dr. Kumail, it was quite popular in the time of the Bani Umayyah, and maybe it was tradition prior to them, to intimidate the enemy by parading the head of an outlaw. Based on that logic, is it at all possible that the head of Imam Hussein was sent to Misr, Egypt?
Well, there are accounts suggesting like, yes, the head were paraded to Egypt as well. But I fail to understand based on the historical reports, which the sources which are accessible to us and at our disposal. If we were to look the timeline and going back and forth between Kufa and Sham, I don't think so. The entire episode of Kufan people is quite clear that people in Kufa were heartfelt by this tragedy. In Sham, yes, in earlier stage they wanted to parade, but eventually there are human sentiments and people in some of them, like in Syria and Ahlul Bayt alayhi being in Syria, they were able to demonstrate the tragic event which unfolded in Karbala a few weeks ago when Lady Zainab Salamullah alayha was in Sham. So parading heads like different parts of like the places, different parts of like Egypt or like Halab or wherever, some scholars have alluded to, they have discussed this, but I personally find it difficult to understand how that would have been occurred in that short period of time.
I'm going to ask a bit of an awkward question, Dr. Fatemi. We do have these narrations that the heads were miraculously transported to the bodies, regardless of where they were buried. Can you shed some light on that before I come to another awkward sort of a question? I don't know how to phrase it properly, so I'll think about it whilst you shed some light on that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know why the awkward question comes to me. I'm not a historian. And actually, when it comes to the details of what happened in the course of history, as our friend said, the history is totally blurred. If you ask me about the incident of Karbala, something which is for certain, such an incident happened. There was a clash and there was a fight. And in brief, such an incident in Karbala has occurred. But more than that, it's all matter of conjecture and conflicting reports, and especially later, let me say, the salvation history type and things like that. So it's very difficult to talk like a proper rational historian in regard of all these details. And even if it was not difficult, I'm not the one who has that expertise to give you a clear picture on that. But I believe there is no such a clear-cut picture on what happened, even in the day of Ashura itself, let alone later in Kufa or Sham, in Medina, Egypt. It's all different reports from Tabari to others. History is very blurred when it comes to the details of the incident.
Well, I suppose what I was after was a text from one of the imams to suggest that the heads are transported to the bodies. But if we don't have anything like that, then I come to a follow-on sort of a question. So when we do ziyarah of Hussein ibn Ali salamullah alayh in Karbala, for us, for all intent and purpose, that is where Imam Hussein, the entirety of Imam Hussein is. Yes?
Yes, okay.
So for us, I mean, we have, through the actions of the children of Imam Hussein, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th Imam.
We do have such a understanding that yes, but you know, at the end of the day, we are connected to the spirit of Imam Hussein, soul of Imam Hussein, rather than think that the body is there or body is not there. That is why we do the same ziyarah from, let's say, Tehran or Birmingham that we do in Karbala. Of course, Karbala as a symbol of, let me say, Shia faith in particular has its own significance. But the ziyarah is a spiritual connection to a spiritual Imam. It's not, I mean, bodily connection.
So more, I wanted to emphasize more than that the very fact that the later Imams have emphasized the ziyarah of Imam Hussein in Karbala itself validates the whole notion that Imam Hussein is to be thought to be in Karbala in his entirety for your consumption. Go to Karbala if you want to visit Imam Hussein.
Yeah, but
and I suppose that's theological validity for everyone.
There is no logical connection between this and that. Imams wanted to keep the movement alive. They wanted to keep the significance of Imam Hussein's move alive. So we need a symbol, we need a city, we need that is the whole thing. By the city and by the shrine and by the ziyarah, you keep the movement alive. That's what's my understanding. So it doesn't have any, let me say, indication logically, hermeneutically toward that conclusion that because they say go and do ziyarah of Karbala, so the entire body is there. We cannot conclude from that.
No, I'm not saying that the entire body is there. Let me just rephrase it, and maybe I'll take Dr. Komail on this one. When we go to the Blessed Prophet and we say, Assalamu alaikum, Ya Rasulullah, in Masjidun Nabi, This is something that the subsequent Imams have done. And therefore they understood that the Nabi is here. Similarly, when we go to Karbala and say Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah, for us, Imam Hussein is their end of story, right? Dr. Kumar.
Yeah, let me simplify what Professor Said Fatemi wanted to say. Hopefully, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but what I understood from his discourse is there is a historical aspect and there is a legal, spiritual aspect. From a legal aspect, yes, legal aspects are not contingent upon historical facts. So legally, if someone has done some nadhr or whatever, they want to perform the ziyarat, they could do it. Yeah, based on what you're suggesting, because Imam have encouraged them again from the reports which we have at our disposal. So legally speaking, theologically speaking, in a larger sense, let's say religiously speaking, that's completely fine based on the reports, based on the ziyarat etiquettes, based on instructions which we have. Yes, one can perform the ziyarat, and the implication of this, legally speaking, is yes, the entire body is there. Historically speaking, however, it doesn't depend upon a hadith or a report or legal aspect or theological implications or whatever. Historians would commit to find the evidence, and there are no evidences clear-cut to prove either case. That's what I understood from Professor Said Fatemi. So legally, yes, but historically, we can't make that conclusion.
Or rather, theologically, yes. As a matter of faith, yes, but as a matter of history is a non-religious, discipline.
Yeah.
So we are at mercy of what's called theological evidences, and theologically, as a Shia, yes. But if you want to prove it historically in a secular manner, you can't prove that.
No, thank you. I'm getting that loud and clear. Thank you. Shaykh Ali, after the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the route that the captives were taken through from Karbala, Damascus, and from Damascus back to Medina, and the timelines.
Ya Allah. I was thinking that you will never ask me this question again. That one of the very hardest questions and I normally propose the Quranic approach that let's not work on numbers. When Allah tells people were so inquisitive that how many Ashab al-Kahf are there, Allah says, don't worry about the number. We know what is there, and the further is in Allah's knowledge.
Okay,
so
if you are not comfortable,
yes.
I'll ask Dr. Komila back to you.
Thank you.
Well, I would beg to differ with Shaykh Ali Kermalli. He is a very good friend of mine. Although Quran, as we say, like Quran is not a historical book, and so for that reason, God and Quran is not interested in numbers. But when it comes to historians, they would precisely get into the details to get the numbers. Yeah. So let's.
So what I meant was that because the history is not very clear on this issue, that was it the first 40 days or was it the whole year and all that, and that's precisely I was escaping the question, but you can go forward.
Yeah, so let's get into the details of the timeline.
I'll just lead into it. Yes, I'll just lead into it. That even the grand scholars such as Mofid, Tusi, Hilli, they have stated that the Ahlul Bayt were in Damascus till the 40th of Imam Hussein.
Sure.
Then you have popular narrations that they were there for 20 days. Ibn Tawus says they were there for 1 month. Qadi Nu'man says they were there for 1.5 months. So this controversy has existed already anyway.
Yeah.
So now with that in mind, if you can take us through the route, going there briefly, the duration of stay and coming back.
Yeah, but well, I would like to be brief and precise as far as like, the Damascus, the timeline which you suggested. I think we could summarize into a 5 sort of like opinions existing between 5th to 7th century, starting from Sheikh al-Mufid and Sheikh Tusi. Early 5th century, the opinion existing among the Shi'i scholars was that Ahlul Bayt returned to Medina, or they started moving from Sham to Medina, either two of this. That was on the Arbaeen. That is what Sheikh Mufid says in early 5th century. Towards the end of 5th century, again, towards early 5th century, we have Sheikh Mufid and Sheikh Tusi narrating that Jabir bin Abdullah al-Ansari arrived in Karbala. But then again, the discussion is like, how he could have gone from Medina or Kufa towards Karbala. The third opinion which we have is towards end of 5th century, mid 5th century, Imaduddin Tabari, who says that Imam's head was buried in Karbala on 20th of Safar, on Arbaeen. So that's the third opinion. Fourth opinion, Jabir and Atiyah jointly, because in earlier tradition we didn't had Atiyah, but now towards like in 6th century, we have Atiyah joining it. So you see that there is gradual sort of embellishment, and the report is getting bigger and bigger. Then when we come to the 7th century, interestingly, the 5th opinion, where we have Jabir, we have like, Ahlul Bayt, and this is attributed to Sayyid ibn Tawus and ibn Numa al-Hilli in the secondary literature. However, we are not sure that Sayyid ibn Tawus or ibn Numa al-Hilli would have suggested that. So what I want to say is, like, based on this 5 opinion, is there is a gradual increase in the substance. Things are being added now and then throughout like 5th to 7th century, and after like 7th century, the scholars have always disputed like what exactly happened, and I just would like to rely on what all the panelists discussed earlier, that history is really blurred.
So I'm going to press you guys on this a little bit more, but before going back and resuming that question, Sayyid Fatimi, what is the significance of Arbaeen within the Islamic Sharia or our spirituality? Not Arbaeen of Imam Hussein, Arbaeen per se.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Arbaeen in Quran, we have the Moses. Arbaeen seems to be a sort of, it does have a spiritual, mystical significance. Even anyone who memorized 40 hadith, then later we have mystics are going 40 days out for their, let me say, spiritual practice. So the number, even some of the interesting, is not popular, but some of the branches of faith somehow associated to the Islamic faith, they go even the age of 40 as the age of maturity, and a man who reach 40, he must be very cautious and move when he's relying. And I mean, the number of Arbaeen has its significance.
Now the Arbaeen of Mauta and Amwat, the Prophet, was his 40th performed, or did the Prophet perform the 40th of Bibi Khadija? Was Imam Ali's Arbaeen ever performed?
I don't know that. Honestly, I have no record of that.
Sheikh Kumail, do you have any idea of any of the Prophet or the previous Imams of Bibi Fatima, their 40th, was it at all performed?
Based on the sources we have, the answer is no. While reading history, we don't come across like these numbers. So yeah.
So therefore, it seems that the notion of the 40th of Amwat is a later introduction within the faith. Where could it have come from? Because I ask our Sunni colleagues, and they say that they don't have any hadith literature. They say the Barelwis may be supporting this idea of 40th, but they don't even know where the Barelwis get it from.
Yeah, Sheikh, I don't think so. Like, anyone within the Shi'i tradition uh, would take this 40th in terms of religious significance. That we go in search of like Quranic verses or hadith as far as spirituality is concerned, or the religious significance is concerned. The day 20th of Safar, Arbaeen of Imam Hussein is commemorated in Shi'i tradition because of some incidents occurring on that day. So, for example, like, as we discussed, like whether Ahlul Bayt arrived in Medina, or like Jabir being in Karbala, or Ahlul Bayt being in Karbala, or head was buried on that day. So that day brings that significance.
Well,
So
that's
there is
very
no sort of like, any association.
so. This is very, very interesting. That Arbaeen in and of itself does not seem to be supported within religious text, but occurrences happening on the day of 40th give 40th of Imam Hussein significance. The immediate sort of theological sort of an implication is that, well, in our conventional understanding that we need to bid farewell to our dead after 40 days does not have religious basis to it at all. Of course, that's on a side note. Shaykh Ali Kermalli, I would like to ask you, when people measure the distance between Kufa and Damascus, they say it's 555 miles. And 555 miles on camel back, if they only travel in the daytime, takes 23 days. If they travel day and night, it takes 11 days. Now, Ahlul Bayt, they left Karbala on the 11th. Now, we know they went to Kufa. In Kufa, and you will have to verify whether this is accurate or not, Ibn Ziyad dispatched a letter to Yazid, and he awaited Yazid's response. The response came, and then the Ahlul Bayt were sent off to Damascus. Then they spent some time there. Then they came back. Now, adding all that together, does it seem possible that they made it back to Karbala on the 20th of Safar?
Okay, so for me, if we go back even to the whole Karbala issue, I have question marks and I have concerns even if they went back to Karbala or not. Okay, so personally, I don't feel that they went to Karbala, because we see that in later sources that they might have gone back to Karbala, and possibly on the assumptions that the head was buried in Karbala. And that's an assumption taken that they went back to Karbala. So if we take those assumptions, everything together, then only the possibility of going back to Karbala comes in. Or if we take Ibn Tawus's opinion, which comes in the late 6th, 7th century, then only the whole possibility of going back to Karbala comes in. Okay, so this is number one. For me, there's a lot of question marks, and the history is, again, the history is clear that from Sham they went back to the way Shaykh Kumail alluded, that Shaykh Mofid says that, Shaykh Tusi says that, they all went back to Medina. Now, did they pass by Karbala? For me, there's a lot of question marks in that historical aspect. In regards to, in regards to the letter sent, I read Shaykh al-Gharawi. He mentions that we don't have historical records to say that Ibn Ziyad sent a letter. In the reliable reports, we don't have reports that Ibn Ziyad sent a letter to Yazid and waited to get a reply. In the process, he just sent the caravan. So again, as I mentioned before, that numbers for me is Shaykh Kumail, I believe, can explain more on numbers. For me personally, I feel there's a lot of assumptions going on depending on the inclination. So Shias, because they love Arbaeen in the later stages, I personally, in my research, have found out that the whole concept of Arbaeen also came with the Safavids. Okay, with the whole process of Safavids, this whole Safar becomes a very noble and it becomes a place where these rituals are held. In Imam's times, I found out only Muharram was very significant. So again, for me, the numbers become then very insignificant then.
No, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to go to Dr. Komer before I go to Dr. Amina. And Fatima, I'll come to you in a second. Dr. Kumail, I'm just asking a very simple question here. Just a very simple question. I would appreciate a straightforward answer. Is it possible to cover the distance between Kufa to Sham, staying one night in Sham, and coming back to Kufa within 40 days?
No.
Is it at all possible to stay just one night in Sham?
No, and I'm not the first one to doubt on this. We took the name of Sayyid ibn Tawus time and again. Sayyid ibn Tawus, in his early book, Luhuf, he says like that book was written for the pilgrims, right? Those who goes for the ziyarat. But later on in his Iqbal, he has concerns and he has doubts in terms of both, whether Ahlul Bayt passed through Karbala and whether they reached Medina on that day. So he is altogether doubting the entire narrative. And that's goes back to the Safid period as well. Allah Majlis, he mentions like, that it's not digestible for him to say that that Imam Hussein's caravan or like, Ahlul Bayt reached to Karbala. So I find it extremely hard to believe that that distance could have been covered in those 40 days.
No, thank you. Thank you for a straightforward answer. Dr. Amina, putting all of that together, would it be reasonable to assume that the heads were sent prior to the women folk of Imam Hussein being sent to Medina? So, for example, when Yazid saw a change within the people of Damascus, is it possible that he could have sent the heads off ahead of the caravan, or together with the caravan, and the caravan could have gone towards Medina, and the heads could have gone to Karbala, and it coincided on the day of the 40th, and the heads reached Karbala on the day of the 40th, and Lady Zainab may have taken another route, because there were obviously women and children, so they were going on the backs of camels very slowly, but man carrying heads could ride very fast towards Karbala straight to bury.
Many things are possible, but I am not personally aware of any historical texts that indicate that particular scenario, and I don't think they were on a time clock and they really felt that the heads would have to arrive specifically on the day of Arbaeen, such that Yazid would really do a rush job and send it, FedEx extra fast post. I think if that were the scenario, maybe Yazid would have just laid them to rest around himself and not really pushed for the return to Karbala. So I think that's, I would have a difficult time historically substantiating that possibility or that suggestion, although of course one can certainly put forward suggestions and give them due consideration.
Yes, you're right. Yazid was in no rush to do anything. Thank you. Dr. Fatemi, moving on now. So from here we cannot establish that the 40th, Lady Zainab and Jabir ibn Abdullah met in Karbala on the 20th of Safar. And according to Dr. Kumail, in all probability, they did not reach Karbala on the 40th, even if they wanted to go towards Karbala. And according to both Sheikh Kumail and Sheikh Ali, the Ahlul Bayt didn't even, more than likely, didn't even take the route towards Karbala. They went straight to Medina. Now coming on to the next thing, Dr. Fatemi, the ziyarah of Hussein Salamullah alayhi is mustahab at all points. We know this by the reading of the ahadith. In addition to that, the ziyarah of Hussein on the day of Arafah is mustahab. On other specific days, the ziyarah of Hussein, we have text that it is mustahab. The orators claim, and they have been claiming for quite a number of years, that every Imam has emphasized the ziyarah of Hussein ibn Ali on the 40th of Imam Hussein. I did a quick search, obviously, a few years ago, and I found that there were only 2 ahadith for the ziyarah of Arbaeen. Can you please shed some light on this?
Yeah, and it's relevant to what we have already been discussing, that the significance of the day Arbaeen for the Shia, does it have any theological basis or any, let me say, religious foundation? Yes, there are two hadith, to my understanding, one from Imam Hassan Askari, but this is, again, Shaykh Kumail can correct me here. To my memory, it is a Mursal hadith.
Found in
And
Tusi, and Tusi
Sheikh
narrated.
Tusi mentioned it in two books, in Tahdhib and Misbah. But
Yes.
in Tahdhib, he is using the word Ruwiya, it's been narrated. So he's not using the word Ibn Qala or something to give it a bit of authenticity. But this is famous riwayah, Alamatul Mu'min Khams, the 5 signs of the believers, and at the end you've got the ziyarah of Arbaeen. The other riwayah, which is the riwayah Safwan from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, Safwan al-Jammal, so that is, but apart from these two riwayah, I don't remember if I've seen something, but these two riwayah plus the huge shuhra add to its own authenticity. But I want to take another route.
But I'll just like to ask you to pause there. Tusi's riwayat are not taken by the ulama because they are marasil. He doesn't quote the names, and the ulama by and large don't agree to them. The riwayah of Safwan from 6th Imam, Hui and others comment that they have majahil in them, at least 1 or 2 majhul al-hal, so they don't take that riwayah as authentic either. Now to consider that we only have 2 riwayah and both of them have their weaknesses, how can we have this claim that it is min al-mustahabbat al-akida? Because this is the claim being made. The ziyarah of Arbaeen is a most emphatic recommendation. How do we derive that?
There are 2 ways to do that. Number 1, the general istihbab. Ziyarah of Imam Hussein is mustahab all the times.
But that is not with the designation of Arbaeen.
Yeah.
That is generally.
And when it comes to Arbaeen, these 2 hadith plus the flexibility usually the jurists would have with such a mustahabbat, not all mustahabbat, by the way, not all the mustahabbat, they might support especially the second hadith, and even the first hadith, they might support it with, let me say, the general principle of at-tasamuh fi adillat as-sunan. There is a bit of tasamuh, flexibility when it comes to the recommended act. Of course, this very general principle of at-tasamuh fi adillat as-sunan is a bit controversial itself. Many accepted, some disputed. From the beginning it was, and within the Sunnah also, it's a disputed principle. Should we be tolerant when it comes to the mustahabbat or mustahabbat also, because it contains attribution and you cannot attribute something to the religion.
I'm going to come to that point, actually, the issue of isnad, attribution. But now, since that you pointed at the Samo, I just want to take us back to Dr. Kumail, and I'm going to come back to you on the isnad issue in a second. Dr. Kumail, seeing that Arbaeen, Arbaeen, with the designation Arbaeen, is not mentioned within any authoritative narration, we can at most say that the ziyarah of Hussein at any point is mustahab. If you do it on the day of Arbaeen, is also mustahab, but not any more mustahab like the ziyarah of Arafah. Arafah is mustahab with the designation of Arafah. Now, Dr. Fatimi is resorting to or hinting that there might be a possibility of rectifying this through at-tasamuh fi adillat as-sunan. Kindly explain to us in simple terms the meaning of the maxim at-tasamuh fi adillat as-sunan.
Yeah, the maxim of Adilat Sunan. I would like to dissect your question into two parts, and Sheikh, please indulge with me in both the levels. So, first of all, in the layman terms, like Tasam of Adilat Sunan is the principle of leniency. We have strict rules and regulation as far as the evaluation and assessment of reports are concerned. But then when it comes to when it comes to some of the acts whose chains of transmissions are not trustworthy or reliable, there are, like, some individuals whose authenticity or whose trustworthiness can't be ascertained. In those instances, the scholars would employ a principle, which is like, for this sort of narrations, as long as it's not like something to do with wajib or haram, we could excuse, we could let go the strict and rigid sort of framework, and we could indulge in those acts, and may Allah reward us for that. That's like, principle of leniency, or tasamu fi adillati sunan. As far as
So I'll just, for the benefit of our viewers, I'll just explain a bit more. It's based on the hadith of Manbala. Basically, it's claimed it's based on the hadith of Manbala, that the Prophet said, he who hears from me something, but they cannot verify it, and they act in accordance with it, then they will have the reward of that act. These are the sort of backings that Qaidatul Tasamo had. So there is no concrete evidence, but we do it because we feel the Blessed Prophet might have said it, he knows might have said it, and we act accordingly, and we get the thawab for it. Please continue.
Yeah, so the provenance of this maxim is much later. In Shi'i tradition, it comes from Shahid al-Awwal, Shahid al-Thani, so 8th century. So throughout like early 700 years of, like, Shi'i tradition, we didn't had this as a principle. The narrations which you mention are reported, and all those narrations boils down to just two narrations of Hisham ibn Salim and Muhammad bin Marwan through two different isnad. So there were some reports, and there is a maxim which initially comes from Nawawi and like Sunni texts. At one point of time, during like 9th century, let's say, Shahid al-Thani, he comes and he patches both the things. Maxim, and then he says these narrations are alluding to that maxim. So 800 years, no one had said like this maxim is backed by those reports and those narrations, which you kindly said, like, Prophet had said this and that. So there is a big sort of gap between being a maxim and, the report suggesting that maxim or report suggesting something else. So that's, a sort of short historical background of this. When it comes to jurists and fuqaha, as Professor Said Fatim has mentioned, like, the fuqaha are in a wide range of opinions. Some of them have said ijma, but that's ridiculously incorrect opinion, and there is no ijma as far as reports are concerned. But then there are fuqahas who would say, like, based on this maxim or reports, we would give the fatwa of istihbab. However, majority of them would not give opinion on that. And although it's among the laity and like common populace, it is well known that for every act they would like to do, they would say, oh, there is tasamo, and because of this report and because of this maxim, everything becomes musa. Two things to be remembered in this aspect. Number one, this maxim does not make anything musa, because Sharia is concrete thing. Even if you want to give a fatwa to something that is a mustahab, you need an evidence. You can't just, based on the conjecture, you can't go take a maxim and make something which is nothing and you make it mustahab. So that shouldn't be done. Number two, even if, like, some scholars would agree and like they would say like it's mustahab, they don't mean istihbab in its term which we people understand. Rather, it would be in the sort of rajal matlubiya, that if you do, then you would get reward, as you and like Said Fatima had mentioned, that ziyarat of Imam Hussein is musab throughout the day and throughout the days and night. Anytime you could perform, but that would not be considered mustahab in a fiqhi sense, because mustahab in a fiqhi sense would have its own implications and consequences and results. For example, if on the day of Eid, ghusl is mustahab, it would mean that I'm exempted from wudu. But then I can't apply this to the ghusl of Ziyarat Arbaeen. I can do ghusl, but that ghusl does not make me exempted from wudu. So you see there are fiqh implications as well.
So yes, Sayyid al-Khuy actually does resort to tasamuh in the ghusl, but then he says that such a ghusl does not suffice in place of wudu. Whereas his general principle was that a mustahab ghusl would suffice in place of wudu. Now, I would like to say, Fatimi, on that and on the question of isnad that we are coming to, I would like to read out a passage from Sayyid al-Khuy and Sayyid Sistani. Sayyid Sistani bi'aynihi uses the very words that Sayyid al-Khuy uses, and in that light I will ask you the isnadi question. So he says, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, it's like reading the Quran for me. إن كثيرا من المستحبات المذكورة في أبواب هذه الرسالة يبتني استحبابها على قاعدة التسامح في أدلة السنن. So the istihbab is based on قاعدة أدلة السنن. He is admitting to that. What is interesting is what comes after. وَلَمَّا لَمْ تَثْبُتْ عِنْدَنَا. And when, since it's not established for us, قاعدة التسامح, then what? فَيَتَعَيَّنَ الْإِتْيَانُ بِهَا بِالرَّجَاءِ الْمَطْلُوبِيَّةِ. And therefore these istihbabat should be performed with the intention of trying to gain the pleasure of God, but we cannot commit ourselves to the intention of mustahabat. وَكَذَا الْحَالِ فِي الْمَكْرُوهَاتِ فَتَتْرُكْ بِالرَّجَاءِ الْمَطْلُوبِيَّةِ. So makruhat cannot be abstained as makruh and disapproved command, but maybe Allah doesn't like it. Sayyid Fatimi, these great ulama, even after using the qaida tasamuh, are not willing to concede that those things that are derived as mustahabat through tasamuh can be considered as mustahab. They are showing utmost reservation. If you can come there, come through now and then talk about isnad as well, sahatul isnad. Because isnad means we are giving that particular act a status in law, and if it's not substantiated, then it's a form of tashri'ah, for example. If you can just clarify that for us.
Okay. Jurists are very concerned about the question of attributability. How we can attribute something to the lawgiver, because that's a claim, and we have to substantiate this claim by the evidences. If we cannot offer authentic, reliable evidences, then that attribution would be a false attribution. And take into account especially the epistemic framework we have in post-Bahbahani, well-developed epistemic framework in post-Bahbahani's discourse, that the basic epistemic assumption is Adam al-Hujjiyah. There is no normative authority for any potential evidence unless we can prove by certainty. That means a question mark for authority is equal to non-authority. Question mark for Hujjiyah is equal to Adam al-Hujjiyah. So they are very careful when it comes to Hujjiyah and authority and authenticity. But on the other hand, they are lenient and flexible when it comes to, generally speaking, good deeds. That is their, I would say, religious intuition, which any common sense person would have that religious intuition, especially taking into account the background that according to all Muslim, whatever permissible act you commit for the sake of God, it is mustahab. So even if you eat for the sake of God, you are doing a mustahab act. Okay? Even if you drink just for the sake of God, for the sake of proximity to God, that is a mustahab act. So taking that mega background that if a believer does something for the sake of proximity to God, then he is doing a good deed, is a mustahab act, in general sense of istihbab that mentioned by Dr. Kumail, not istihbab in a particular sense as a one of the 5 category of the ontological norms. So istihbab does have the notion of it's good to be done.
So no, building on that now, can we have a collective istihbab that, okay, let's say a group of people are doing the ziyarah of Imam Hussein on a particular time of the day. Yes? Like they're going at 9 o'clock in the morning, diligently, and doing the ziyarah of Imam Hussein. Does that then bring about a notion of that everybody should do the ziyarah of Hussein ibn Ali at 9 o'clock in the morning, for example, based on that reasoning? Or is that just something individual?
No, it would be something individual. Unless I say you do have a very solid, well-founded evidence for that. Otherwise, it would be individual. But add to that, please, we need to take into account. And although this is a postmodern idea, but you have to take it seriously, one part of the authenticity is the collective reflection and collective action of the community. When the community at large sees something as a reflection of their faith, it does add to the value. And actually, my understanding of Sayyid Murtada in particular, when he was usually supporting Khabar Wahid by Ijma, he was a somehow communitarian jurist at his time. So he was taking the backing of the community very seriously. Shia community at large, if they think something is good, and that thing also, common sensely speaking, rationally speaking, ethically speaking, is not a bad thing, then why not to have that leniency?
No, I agree.
Yeah, but Sayyid Fatimi, but Sayyid Murtaza failed, right, in his project, being communitarian?
Yeah. That's what's very unfortunate of Shia community, that Sheikh Tusi, influenced by Shafi'i, was the victorious here. Sheikh Tusi was total departure from Sayyid Murtada.
Yeah, Sheikh Arif, so I'm very sorry to chime in over here, but just one liner. So the conclusion which we could derive is like being a communitarian and being against the popular voice won't necessarily lead to a failure of a project, right?
Yeah. But being communitarian doesn't mean being populist, by the way. Populism is something different than communitarianism. Communitarianism is a term of art. It does have political and social significance, and it helps for the solidarity of the community. But populism is a different thing. My understanding, Sayyid Murtaza was communitarian in a sense that he was caring for the consensus of the community as a support for the authenticity of a hadith. And we lost that, unfortunately, to the Sheikh Tusi discourse, which was totally a reflection of Shafi'i's discourse in Shia circle.
So building on that particular point that you made, that if it's given value by the populace or the general understanding, then obviously it acquires value in and of itself. And in that way, it becomes a recommendation. So I'm coming to Dr. Amina. When we go for Arbaeen, we cannot deny that it is a spiritually uplifting experience. It's a beautiful experience. It is more beautiful and uplifting than ziyarah on Arafah, which is highly recommended. And it is more uplifting in certain cases than maybe going for Umrah as well. That spiritual communal spirituality brings about its own value. Considering that, do we even need authentication from the Sharia sources when such things are so prominently, abundantly evident?
I am of the view that I don't think this should be discussed primarily from a Sharia perspective, because the majority of what people do on Arbaeen is not a Sharia matter. For example, you could take the premise either Ziyarat al-Arbaeen is Sharia-wise mustahab or not, and you put forward some arguments such as, yes, the few hadith exist, yes, they're mursal. Okay, so you can argue that for a while. It exists in the books. It didn't come from nowhere, but it's not as strongly substantiated as many other things. But most of what people do on Arbaeen is not literally recite the Ziyarat of Arbaeen. They hold majalis before and after. There are certain narratives that are customarily discussed. It might be a time for community gathering, all of the things which are good and recommended, but not specifically relating to the Sharia question of Arbaeen. And so I think it's better just to take it along the lines as it appears. It is mentioned in the tradition. The hadith of Jabir is mentioned. You can question it. You can question how long it takes to get from a certain place to another. Could it have happened in the same year? Could it have happened in a different year? Maybe they didn't return at all. And I think it's good for people to be able to tolerate the idea that there may be some gray areas historically. But in the end, that really doesn't have a lot to do with what we do on Arbaeen, which is, by and large, the things that we do discuss surrounding Arbaeen are fairly well historically substantiated. A lot of people will focus, for example, on the arrival into Damascus and certain things that happened. Now, don't open that Pandora's box. I'm not saying every detail is authentic, but when we talk about other aspects of the narrative that are not specifically regarding whether or not they met Jabir in Karbala. And so from that angle, it's not just a question of is it Sharia mandated or just a good thing. There are a number of things that are either historically established or are part of the tradition, while at the same time it's perfectly legitimate to question these. And I think the problem a lot of the Muslim world has today is not Shi'is or someone else. It is a sense that everything has to be black or white and very literally right and wrong, and we need to just kind of find certain wrongs and just get rid of them. I mean, like I said, it's there, and it's not a fib to say it's there. I agree with the view that the importance of Arbaeen does seem to have developed over time. I would even agree with the view that by and large the custom of celebrating an Arbaeen seems to have been a regional custom, and maybe not something specifically introduced by Islam. But wasn't the Hajj a regional custom? You know, did Islam specifically introduce the Hajj? We have a lot of death customs that are that aren't necessarily mandated, but they're also not refuted, like using hearses to carry people, like happens nowadays. And so there's a certain flexibility beyond just, well, it's a good thing versus, is it or is it not a Sharia issue? And I do think for most people, the main function that Arbaeen serves, with respect to at least those who commemorate Ashura, is that it does provide closure. Because if you stop at Ashura with everyone being killed and you don't discuss it afterwards, then you're sort of left hanging. Well, they lost the battle and what happened. But the narrative comes to its conclusion in Arbaeen, and that's where we do see the broader values, such as the victory of truth over falsehood. That's where we see them enacted. And because the custom of the Shi'is seems to be to relive the happinesses and sorrows of Ahlul Bayt, by going through that full mourning period, we are in a sense reliving it in a way that's become customary. But of course, it doesn't have to happen specifically on Arbaeen. It simply has. But I don't really see a reason to. I don't see a strong need to try to shoot that down. If there are particular practices or customs which are unhealthy or problematic areas, then they could be addressed. So, for example, some people have said it puts a lot of stress on the Iraqi infrastructure these days to have so many people coming in, or there might be security issues. It is very crowded. So, that's an area where we can say, okay, that there's no reason specifically why people have to come on these specific days to Karbala from all over the world. This is a fairly new thing to have these large masses of people like this. So we could say maybe it doesn't need to be done and we can do something else, but that's not saying that's not saying the idea of Arbaeen hasn't existed in our tradition or in some of our books. It's just saying it's not mandated. The problem is everything has to be absolutely mandated or not. We don't have an intermediate area these days.
Thank you so much. Now, obviously, I concur and sympathize with your sentiments. The problem here is that when we attribute a particular thing to God and His Prophet and His family have not allowed us to do that, And the Quran does not allow us to do that. So if we can make it clear that Arbaeen, to the original text, the ziyarah is not mustahab, then that is perfectly fine. We wish to do it, and it is the best ziyarah. It's better than any mustahab ziyarah.
That's not what I said. I said the ziyarat exists in our texts, and for many matters we use mursal hadith. We don't need to have like absolute authentication of every narrator for every dua. You go through.
No, I'm not,
if you want to use that standard, you're going to throw out a lot of our duas that are respected.
I'm not saying what you said. I'm just I'm drawing on something else. When the orators go and emphasize that it is the most mustahab ziyarah that every imam has talked about, that is the clarity we are making, that it's not something that every imam has talked about, but nonetheless, due to its value, it is something highly desirable in itself. And for that, we may not even need the text to substantiate it. I'm concurring with you fully. But I'm just
but that's a problem with some of the orators or some of the lay people. I mean, I really hate to use those phrases, but the average person who's never gone through the text and who just reads a book on this is what you're supposed to do in Shi'i Islam can't tell the difference between the strong emphasis that is given to, for example, certain acts on Ashura versus the fact that, well, we don't really have the idea of commemorating the whole month of Muharram as a mourning month in our texts generally. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying there's a difference. So they can't weigh those particular differences. That sort of nuance generally comes at the scholarly level or for someone who's taken the effort to research these matters. But again, it's not an either or sort of thing. And a lot of the the speeches that come out today, which are very ardently that, the hadith prescribe 100% certain acts in Arbaeen and you have to do them. Like you have to go to Najaf from Iran and walk to Karbala. There are other issues at hand there. It's not really a textual issue. It's a social issue or a political issue, a cultural issue. And people are just basically either they're not being responsible and doing the research when they're speaking, or they might be a little bit twisting things. But that doesn't change the fact that we do have these things in the text, and it would be a lie to say that we don't have them in the texts, that they're simply not as strongly supported as certain other things. And some of the imams did bring in things from the later time that were not present at the time of the Prophet, and insofar as they're not like introducing, a bid'ah or changing a major issue of the religion, it's acceptable. It happens in our tradition. So basically, I'm suggesting a balanced viewpoint that is healthy for this sort of issue, and people should be responsible when they talk about them from the minbar.
I'll just build on that, Shaykh Ali Kermalli. Now, if we were to take that standard, then Jamkaran is also mustahab to go and visit and do the ziyarah of the 12th Imam and sit there all night long and pray. Now, Jamkaran has huge value. I always go there. Well, I used to when I used to live in Qom. Where does it stop? I know Imam Ali has said, Malik in Nahjul Balagha, that introduce a good tradition, and those good traditions that have been introduced, follow them. But where does it stop? Jamkaran has become a whole culture now, and it's very uplifting, sometimes more uplifting than praying itself. Can I have your thoughts?
I will partially differ with the other panelists, as much as keeping the balance is very important. We all believe that doing good acts and doing good practices is a very good thing. But for me, at least, somebody who is, my specialty is Quranic studies. For me, I don't know why I am really concerned with the word iftira in the Quran. This whole process of trying to twist words, that tasamuh, and then raja'ul matlubiyya, and then from istihbab, we don't mean istihbab, which is the terminology, but we mean raja'ul matlubiyya. There are 4 or 5 opinions on this issue. For me personally, I follow this verse of the Quran in Surah Yunus. Allah is talking to the mushrikeen and He tells them, فَجَعَلْتُم مِّنْهُ حَرَامًا وَحَلَالًا. Okay, you are making things halal and haram out of your own wishes. So then Allah tells the Prophet, tell them, Allahu adhina lakum am ala Allahi taftarun. So for me personally, I don't know why I am inclined towards saying no. We need to differentiate between Allah's verdicts and Sharia, and our own social culture. And as long as the social culture is taking us to Allah, it's perfectly fine. But we need to distinguish between that, because what's happening is, my worry is when it doesn't stop, this tasamuh and this raja and all this is now, I like giving example that it's having theological implications. So for example, hadith kisa, the longer version, is not authentic by all standards. But notice how the member and the orators use this hadith kisa to make tall claims in aqaid, in our theology and in our belief. Okay, so personally myself, I'm very much that thing that we need to make this distinction, that iftira al-Allah, that we keep Allah on one side and we keep our norms which are good, and we keep that sunnah, that whatever takes us to Allah is good and whatever stops us from going to Allah is not good. So that's my criteria, and that is where Jamkaran comes in. The Jamkaran is a very social issue. The Iranians, the whole building and everything started 300-400 years ago. And the whole establishment of Jamkaran was done after the revolution. So it doesn't seem it's 400 years old. Okay, and so that's my humble understanding. I hope I made myself clear.
So yes, we've run out of time. In fact, we've gone over time. I would like to thank you all and conclude that Imam Hussein definitely was a cause for the toppling of the Bani Umayyah. And the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and his forceful stand against oppression also kept Banu Abbas in check. Imam Hussein has inspired subsequently historical uprising against tyrants and despots. Imam Hussein is that impetus for us to stand for the rights of the oppressed and stand for our own liberty. He gives us that sense of dignity. Lady Zainab did export the message of Imam Hussein in a very effective manner, whether we have the details or not. This is a female within an Arab, male, predominant, chauvinistic setting who speaks eloquently and forcefully, and without a doubt, she has stirred them and their emotions. So Lady Zainab plays a huge role in taking out the message of Imam Hussein from Karbala. Whether Imam Hussein envisaged that from the very beginning, or it just happened to be by God's plan, Allah knows best. I would like to think Imam Hussein himself must have thought it through and taken her with him. But that's my personal sort of leaning. As far as the route of the caravan and the captives and the return is concerned, we cannot be sure that they passed through Karbala. Evidence suggests that they did not pass through Karbala. Even if they did pass through Karbala, it did not coincide with the day of Arbaeen. Nonetheless, that is not to say that Arbaeen does not have value in and of itself. The heads may have been buried on the day of Arbaeen. The heads of Imam Hussein and his noble companions may be buried in Karbala or elsewhere. But for the sake of our consumption and our spirituality, they are in Karbala, and we do the ziyarah of Imam Hussein as if the entirety of Hussein ibn Ali is there. And nothing is beyond God. As far as the ziyarah of Hussein is concerned, it is mustahab at every point, regardless whenever we want to go. But the ziyarah of Arbaeen does not enjoy the same significance as the ziyarat of Arafah and other ziyarat that the hadith literature categorically mentions. Finally, Arbaeen is a source of great inspiration. Imam Ali said to Malik Ashtar, that if somebody has left a good tradition, follow it. But that does not mean give it a religious coloring. We need to be mindful, as Shaykh Ali Kermalli said, A'ala Allah taftarun, are you fabricating in the name of Allah? And Allah reprimands those people and is very clear, don't associate or attribute with me something that I have not said. And similar was the sentiment of the Blessed Prophet, that don't attribute to me something that you do not know. In terms of qaida, tasamuh, fi adillati sunan, It's a gray area, whether there is such a maxim or not in the first instance. Even if there is that maxim, then Sayyid, the likes of Sayyid Mohsin al-Hakim, Sayyid Khouy and Sayyid Sistani do not believe in such a maxim, and therefore anything performed in light of such a maxim does not acquire the status of istihbab. Tomorrow, we will be looking at the Sunni perception of Shia mourning rituals. They will be quite open with the way they understand the Shias through the commemoration of Hussein ibn Ali, and we want them to be open. Our Sunni ulama that we have tomorrow will be Sheikh Umar Ramadan, Maulana Abdul Hadi Al-Umri, Dr. Imran Ali Khan, and obviously they will be asking for clarity. So from the Shia side, we will have Dr. Komail Rajani and Dr. Ali Reza Bhojani, who will try his best to make it for the beginning of the program. If not, then he will join later on. So I hope you will all join us for tomorrow. And I've been asked to mention that Sheikh Safdar Razi sends his apologies for not being able to make it today. Inshallah, Allah bless us all. See you all tomorrow. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.